Hello, I'm John Grom, and this is the Right and Left Discussion Forum. Due to a technical glitch today, we happen to be without our normal graphics, but I'm sure that we'll survive. Right and Left is a nonprofit corporation committed to the promotion of civil political discourse. Our sole purpose is to urge voters to be a more insistent voice in the political process by demanding respectful dialogue and a commitment to finding common ground. Today, our panel will discuss affirmative action. In the wake of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawing most forms of discrimination based on race, gender, religion, and national origin, a limited form of affirmative action was instituted by President Lyndon Johnson via an executive order. The order was to stimulate equal employment opportunities. The order gave authority to the Secretary of Labor to establish minority hiring goals for the construction companies doing business with the federal government. In the early 70s, under President Nixon, the executive order was expanded to include any organization with any activity involving the federal government, including contractors, subcontractors, banks, hospitals, and universities. The apparent conflict between the act of Congress that prohibited racial preferences and an executive order that demanded them created controversy that exists till today. More than a dozen Supreme Court cases, numerous ballot initiatives have failed to produce a national consensus on affirmative action, but that does not intimidate our panel. Our panelists today begin on my left are Dr. Ronald Chamberlin. Ron is a retired senior research chemist and an active, very active humanitarian. On his left is Bryan Laubaugh. Bryan is president of R&B Financial Consultants and a member of the Medina County Republican Executive Committee. On his left is Patty Haskins, a retired math teacher and one of only two Democrats on the Wadsworth City Council. As usual, I would like to turn to Ron Chamberlin first. Ron, as you know, there are arguments galore, both pro and con, about this issue. Do you think the last 40 years of affirmative action have had a net positive or a negative effect on our culture, and should it be continued?
John, I come today for enlightenment and education. I know very little about this. I've not had, to my knowledge, any direct impact upon myself in this. I haven't known any black contractors who have received jobs because of this, or any white contractors who have lost jobs because of this. I did work for some 16 years for a company which got most of its funding, a great deal of its funding, from the Department of Energy. So I know that that was in effect. I remember thinking at the time, though, and here's where my liberal impulses come in, saying, gee, what a great idea. This is gonna, even, I know we have the Civil Rights Act is in place, and I know that's true, but I know how slow those things are to change in society. I thought this would be a good kick in the pants, just to get things started, to try to level that playing field a little bit. Now, thinking about that further, says, well, then that gives rise to a quota system, which isn't necessarily good. So from there, I want to hear what everyone else has to say.
Okay, Ron. Bryan, you've been doing some thinking about this. I know you have.
I think I would agree that in a limited scope, discrimination laws that are in place on a limited basis would level the playing field and make an environment more conducive to having individuals that might be or be considered a select group that need a little bit of help. But I think the program, as I think I've witnessed, has grown to the point where it has really become more of a negative on society. And I come to that conclusion because it's grown into more of a preference-based instead of a equal level the playing field solution. It's grown into a preference where universities, companies that do business with the government are looking to diversify their employee base or their teachers, their professors, and when we get into that area, I think it's fraught with real problems.
Patty, you've been a union leader.
Yes, I have been for many years. Yes.
Has this had an impact on you during your career?
Not within my union experience whatsoever. My opinions on this, number one, when this was brought into place, it was sorely needed to provide for discrimination that was occurring, and it originally started to affect the African American community, but it's now been expanded to include women and to include Hispanics and any minority group that might be discriminated amongst. I think there's no denying that it's had a positive influence on our country. If you look for at college campuses, for example, I think there's a lot to be said about having a heterogeneous group of people for students to work with and to study with, as opposed to just one homogeneous group, and the cultural diversity that is brought along with that. That being said, there are those that feel that we've come far enough and we don't need to proceed any farther. I read an interesting report, and it was from the United Nations, saying at this particular time, white American males are, I think it's number 2 in the world as far as their educational experience, their life expectancy, their education. However, African Americans are still 27th in the world, and Hispanic Americans are even worse at, I think it's 32nd. So obviously there is still more to be done with this. I think some of the concerns arise, though, when we look at, for example, in education, at some of the universities, it depends upon how they are using race to select candidates for admission into the university. The Supreme Court has ruled that race can be one of the considerations, along with many others. But different universities use different weighting systems. And that's where the problem arises, where if race is, doubles a person's score or adds 200 points to their SAT scores, is that a fair way to prevent the discrimination that might occur in the university otherwise?
Unfortunately, one of the things we're never going to know is what would have happened over the last 40 years without affirmative action.
You can't do that experiment. You can't do a scientific experiment here.
No, you can't. Looking at the history of black progress measured by employment, life expectancy, home ownership, and some other factors, after World War II, African Americans particularly were making tremendous progress in all of those levels. In fact, in the income, they had increased by 40% between the 1940 and 1970. And that the feeling was, and my instincts tell me, that without affirmative action, they would have continued to progress in all of those levels the way they had been going, and maybe even accelerated, because they were making progress in spite of Jim Crow, which was a terrible thing, and that. But after affirmative action was put in place, everything leveled off. And in the 40 years since, the black incomes have only increased 10%. It increased 40 in the 30 years before that. And so we're never going to know. Having said that, of course, the time period we're talking about with the tremendous increase in incomes is also the Great Migration. And a sharecropper didn't make anywhere near as much as an auto worker. So there were those things to consider. But we will never know how the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would have impacted our culture without affirmative action. My concern, and I don't expect any of you to have a tremendous experience base to respond to this, but my concern is that when I look at the self-esteem impact that affirmative action has on minorities, I have to be very, very concerned. I'm concerned about a very, very successful, high-achieving individual that didn't need affirmative action, but they'll always have this stigma. They'll never receive credit for everything that he's done, or her. Shelby Steele wrote a book called White Guilt. And one of the things that he said that he really laments is the fact that a black intellectual, a black professional, will never be regarded as the best person. They'll always be regarded as the best black, and because of affirmative action. Now dive in on that concept, because I think it's I think it's my instincts tell me that it has a very negative impact.
You part of your original question is, what do you think about this? And thought and data are different sometimes. I don't have the data. I don't know that anybody has the data. As you say, it's going to be hard to get that. But I've heard the term used by black people, well, I'm the token black in this company. And when I first went to work for a company in Connecticut, they had one black person on staff. Now, she happened to be the human resources person, fairly high up in the company.
That was usually
but
the
she
first.
Was the only one for 5 or 6 years. So I got a couple of technicians in. It was a scientific company. There were probably 15 or 20 language groups represented among the staff because of Asians and Indians and Pakistanis and what have you, but weren't any blacks for a while.
Yeah.
Now, again, I heard our purchasing guy said, yeah, well, we can't take that company. We need to take this, buy from this supplier. And they said, well, we're trying to base it on reliability of the supplier, but affirmative action is there too, and I know they were responsive to that. But
Well, I think discrimination, and I'd like to go back to that to make sure that anyone would understand that discrimination in any form really is not what I would agree with. I think everyone needs an opportunity to succeed, but when you're looking for the best person, that best person should be the best person, not the best woman, or the best black person, or the best Hispanic person,
or the best white person,
or the best white person. It should be the best person for that job. And when we try to social engineer that best person, I think that's where we get into these issues where, is it really the best person?
Yeah.
Does the best person really sit in that office, or is that best person the person that's providing, doing my surgery for me on my heart, or, where do you stop? And I think when we take and try to manipulate that to somehow create an environment for affirmative action or a preference, we get into the problems that you just mentioned about self-esteem. My children tell a funny story. When they all came through soccer, they were in these leagues where they never kept score. Everybody won. And they would come up to me and they'd say, Dad, we had a great game, and they didn't keep score. And I'd say, well, I did, and you lost.
Good for you.
And it was 10-3. And this notion that somehow we have to remove that because it might damage or impede a child's self-esteem, I think it works in a larger aspect when you start dealing with preferences and affirmative action. I want the best person, and if the best person is Patty Haskins, I want that person to work with me for whatever the task is. I don't particularly care that she's a woman or a Democrat. I want the best person. And if she's come through a system where it says that, she got an extra few points on her SAT, I'm kind of wondering about that. So I guess that's where I would come down on it, and that might be a little, Neanderthal, but...
Do you think it's Neanderthal, Patty?
Never with Bryan.
Thank you, Patty.
You're welcome. When you talked about the esteem factor and how the individual feels, I don't know that they all feel, oh, gee, I just got here because of that. I think in many cases what we're looking at is people that come from a disadvantaged area, possibly. Now, understand that could be a African American, it could be a white person that comes from a disadvantaged area, from an inner city area where the schools are not as good, where they have not had those opportunities, and they look at it as, I need that extra boost to get into a good college where I can excel.
I can use my innate abilities.
I can use my abilities and have the better teachers, have the best opportunities, have the opportunities to go into different jobs. So I don't think that they're looking at it from that standpoint. I think they're looking at it as making it an even, playing field. As far as the best person for the job, sometimes it's difficult to determine who that best person is. And I think the idea with affirmative action is to put everybody on an equal playing field starting out. Now, quotas many times have been, I believe quotas have been
Goals.
Have been turned down by the Supreme Court.
Yeah, they're called goals.
Yes, you could set up this, requirement and this requirement, but you can't actually say we have to hire 2 black people and 3 Hispanics and 5 women and 6 whites. I mean, that can't be done. Without that affirmative action, though, the concern is that we would revert to that employer looking at race, looking at gender in order to determine the position, as opposed to actually accepting the best person for the job.
That's what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was all about,
Right.
to make sure that we eliminate discrimination based on all of these extraneous factors. One of the problems that people complain about is that affirmative action has really helped a lot of people who didn't need the help. They were already, when I think about somebody that was, finished at the bottom of the list on the Harvard entrance, that's, I don't know where I would have finished on that exam. But I heard Sonia Sotomayor the other day on the radio, and she was talking about the fact that she does favor affirmative action, which is very nice of a Supreme Court justice to just come out and admit that, but that she was admitted into Harvard under an affirmative action goal, and that she makes no apology about that. But my thought was, well, maybe she could have gotten into Princeton without it, and I'm not sure that our culture progressed a whole lot by her getting into Harvard instead of Princeton. She might have still become a Supreme Court justice. I don't know what the standards are at Princeton. But as you mentioned, Patty, there are all sorts of disadvantages. But in affirmative action, we're only taking race and gender, not economic disadvantage. And there, of course, there's the old comparison between the coal miner's son and the black neurosurgeon's son from New York, and that the neurosurgeon's son is certainly not disadvantaged, but the coal miner's son is. But he's considered a privileged person under the law, at least under the executive order. But I'll just make this one point and then I'll stop talking here. But but race preference is only one part of affirmative action. Expanding the pool of qualified candidates purposely to include more women, Hispanics, African Americans is also part of it. That you're looking for more people that do qualify without having to lower the bar, and that. I've had my own personal experience with that. I've been in the employment business for over 40 years, and that I think that for 10 years I was on the corporate staff of a Fortune 500 company, and then for the rest of the time as an independent headhunter, as it were. And that I've had to sign for every client that I've ever worked with, I had to sign this agreement that I would not discriminate in recruiting for that company. I would not discriminate on race, gender, even included South Sea Islanders and Native Americans and so forth in that thing. But I never agreed that I would show racial preferences, and I never really did. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But how do you feel about the fact that we're only taking these race and gender things into consideration and not economic disadvantages?
I think that's where the disparity of education comes into play here. And I felt for a long time that there are people who need a leg up on that. whether they're, as Patty was just saying, give the opportunity to get into that better school, the opportunity to, and it comes down to money. You know, what do we put into our school districts? What do we put into teachers? Well, how do we try to get better education into the less economically advantaged areas of our cities, particularly? But I've known some pretty not very well educated rural folks too. So from a rural area, and I don't know. I think that's more of a key to getting that kind of level playing field. I guess sorry I used that metaphor, but anyway, then lack of racial discrimination. I think educational discrimination is out there. Our educational choices are out there. An employer has to make those based on what he sees the qualifications of the person. My naivety says that, well, yeah, everyone's going to, now we have this law, no one's going to be involved. We're going to pick the best person for the job. Realistically, that ain't going to happen.
Yeah. You taught in a school system.
Yes, I did.
That was
Excellent.
predominantly WASP. Call them WASPs.
White Anglo-Saxon product. In
Very-
this town, a lot of it.
Yes.
Yeah. And did you have very many minority teachers?
No. No.
Did you have any?
Over my career, I can think of 2.
Only 2.
Yes.
Wow.
So, and the makeup of the student body was very
White.
homogeneous. So there was not a lot of cultural diversity, and that's the makeup of the community, that
Yes.
we live in. So I think, to me, it was important, at least for my own children, to have some cultural diversity. So, I mean, I did. My daughter went to Our Lady of the Elms for 8 years, which I know is blasphemy since I taught here. She did go to Wadsworth High School. And part of my reason for that was for her to have that cultural diversity. And she did. I mean,
Yeah.
she had African Americans, she had Muslim students, I mean, the whole thing. And that really, I think, broadened her awareness of people and of different cultures. And I thought that was really a very good thing for her.
I think that is important too. When we left Wadsworth and moved to Danbury, Connecticut, my youngest son was just entering middle school, and he entered what was the largest high school in the state, in Danbury. And whatever race or ethnic background you would want, it was there in Danbury. It was Danbury is about 75 miles out of New York City. It is a high-tech community. Many companies, Union Carbide's main office is there. So you can imagine the population consists of many people from Asia, from Southeast Asia, from Europe, from the South. A large proportion of Southeast Asians. 300 Portuguese families have been there for 100 years working in the hat factories. Danbury used to be famous for making hats while hats were still worn by men. All of that, and it was really good for him. The whole cultural change was difficult for him at first. He had some good teachers who took him under their wing and kind of mentored him along for the first year or so, and he did very, very well with that. And in contrast to my other sons, who also cope very well with their lives in a diverse world, but he got a real quick education, and it was very good. I can see that it's developed some of his attitudes and experiences throughout the years into that diversity. And that has nothing to do with really affirmative action, but diversity and the fact that there were folks from all races and backgrounds who were in the same academic level as him, as well as in all the other academic levels around him, I think was very beneficial.
In the minute and a half we have left, I just want to lament one more point. And I read an article not too long ago written by a guy who was admitted into a top Ivy League school. And he was complaining because he flunked out at the end of his first year, dropped his major, re-enrolled 2 years later in a less rigorous discipline. He was in probably the bottom third, maybe even the bottom fourth in class standing of the people that were in his freshman class at the Ivy League college. He had not been warned on how difficult it was going to be for him to compete with people whose SAT scores, high school credentials, were so far ahead of his. And that although he went back to the same school, in like I say, in a less rigorous discipline, he wondered, would he not have been better off had he gone to a school that didn't have such high standards, like maybe gone to a state university. That's one of the drawbacks, I think, to affirmative action. But in closing, I'll just say that affirmative action has helped tremendously in increasing the number of minority people in the top professions, but has done almost nothing for people in the inner city, where 1/3 are still in poverty. Drugs and crime are a big issue. A horribly disproportionate number of people, young men particularly, incarcerated and so forth. But I want to thank you for the comments about affirmative action, and that our goal here was to show that we could have a discussion about something that's potentially contentious, and we hope that the listening audience found this program provocative. To learn more about Right and Left, please visit our temporary website, rightandleft.org. To become a volunteer or to make a monetary contribution to this nonprofit corporation, please contact me, John Grom, at 330-336-2213. And I would like to leave with this advice from Adam Grom, who's an instrumental music director, advice to his students. Listen and adjust. Blend your tone, balance your volume. These ensemble performance fundamentals easily apply to our daily lives by listening, adjusting, blending our tone, and balancing our volume. We create a better community with similar goals and priorities. Thank you very much.